Hello, ladies, gentlemen, and everybody in between. My name is Kexman. I am joined by Sco, and with us we have the incredible Morgan Day. And we do have some questions, especially considering the Vault of Incarnates is just around the corner. And I know, Sco, you've been wanting to ask this question for a little while now, so why don't you take it away for this first one?
Going to start off with some of the top questions for Morgan here. Is there any teaser you can give us for Raszageth in the raid right now? What kind of fight are we looking at? Are we looking at maybe like a Black Hand fight? We're looking at like a Queen of Shara fight. Like, what would you kind of compare it to? Like, what we're looking at with the current iteration of the boss?
Yeah, totally. So like in terms of duration, I think we'd probably look at something closer to Blackhand in terms of like the fight structure, more like that versus, a much longer duration of Jara. Teasers, nothing super specific, right? Like nothing, I don't want to spoil anything there. But, I can speak a little bit to just kind of the way, we approach end bosses and developing kind of the ultimate boss in the raid. So, ultimately, like our goal with an end boss is to make sure that we're testing a variety of things for you to succeed, right? So when you're looking at progression on an end boss, something that we're constantly measuring is like, okay, what are we testing in this first phase? Like, is it utility? Is it single target damage? Is it AoE damage? And making sure that as you progress through the encounter, we're constantly throwing new challenges at you for a couple of reasons. One, we think that's just interesting, right? Like that just creates some interesting puzzles for the player to solve. And then, especially with the new talent system out right now, we think that'll be really fun to be able to kind of dive into all the options that are available there. And then also, it's always fun seeing, kind of the composition swaps as new parts of an end boss get kind of revealed. They're like, it's always interesting to see like the raid swaps that happen. And sometimes the raid actually starts to look pretty heavy in one direction or another in terms of like role or class. But ultimately, we look at by the end of the fight, if we've done a really good job with testing different things, you should need a pretty balanced composition to kind of execute against all the different things that we're throwing at the player.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense for sure. In regards to the raid itself, what would you say, the goal of the tuning in week one of the race world first here? Obviously, we have Christmas coming up soon. You've released Heroic Mythic Plus and everything at the same time. What would you say is like the goal of the tuning for this first week of the raid? What are you kind of expecting?
Right, totally. So, I mean, I assume you're talking about Mythic difficulty?
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I imagine, like with most raids, or at least the hope is that, some of those initial bosses won't hold up too much of a fight, especially for some of the top rating guilds. But as you get deeper into the raid, that's where we really start to look at kind of those big bumps in the road and some of those, more mid-tier in the raid instance blockers, essentially, that really start to take a lot more attempts to start to push through it. So, we imagine the first at least half of the raid probably won't put up too much of a fight. There's a lot of progression, even within a raid itself, in terms of, where the target audience for certain bosses might be, or what the expectation might be for how long they last. But certainly in that first week, well, hopefully in that first week, people also, I would say, are able to get to Raszageth, right? Like we want to see people progressing there. And like you said, obviously we hope everything is cleared by the holidays, because that is definitely something that we're keeping a close eye on. I've heard people joke that they'll go in there and like death touch it themselves if they have to, which obviously we wouldn't do, but we're definitely keeping an eye on the holidays.
So possibly some week one clear is being predicted here.
I will never say never. That has happened in the past, but ultimately we really, success to us is that people have fun. Not only the high end, but also across all difficulties. We really want to make sure we're keeping an eye on, those friends and family raiders who are just trying to kill a couple bosses in normal mode, as well as all the way up to the top where people are pushing for world first there.
100%. That will be me these days after retiring from the raid roster. I'm excited to get in there and do some heroic and normal, probably in between the race to world first for sure.
There we go. I can't wait to see it.
Making the game more accessible to people is definitely a great goal for sure. I think the launch of the expansion so far has been absolutely amazing. Like I've really enjoyed Dragonflight. Probably, I mean, I've been playing the game for like since release 2005, right? And I would say this expansion, it's something different. I think so. It's been amazing. So great job to you and the team on that one for sure.
Awesome, I appreciate it. Yeah, you've been doing like any of those like public events, like doing any fishing?
Yes,
Actually, okay.
Yes,
Yes,
chef.
yes, yeah.
That's awesome.
You mentioned, I mean, you obviously spoke about the difficulty with Raszageth and Mythic, and that kind of ties in with one of the changes we've seen recently with, you know, BoEs actually being BOP in the Mythic difficulty. When you spoke about Vault of Incarnates in the first place, you mentioned the slight change in the ideas behind BoEs in lieutenants around the raid, and those are the ones that are going to drop the BoEs. Is that something you folks are still going with Vault? Is it a guaranteed BoE off these lieutenants, or is it more of this is where your chance is every week?
Right. So that what we've actually had to adjust that a little bit. To your point, though, yes, the BoEs will be BOP for at least the first couple weeks on Mythic difficulty. And in terms of lieutenants, we ended up having to pull back a bit on that. You know, lieutenants will still be rewarding and valuable, and will have an opportunity to drop BoEs, but they won't be the only thing in the raid that can drop that. Ultimately, you know, when you see people death skipping trash and just like, you know, running to the boss and face planning, when we look at that, really what that says to us is, well, we need to make it more rewarding to actually want to kill the trash, right? Like trash serves a lot of different purposes in a raid, from, you know, helping to tell the story of what the heck is going on in this place, all the way to like pacing, right? Like we feel like just, hey, this is a good time to go get a drink, chill out, socialize, right? Like talk to each other. Raiding is a really social experience, and you know, if you're constantly just progressing on raid bosses, that can be really stressful. So having kind of that trash in between to help pace out the experience a bit more is something that we feel really strongly about. So we want to make sure that the trash is rewarding. We still like the idea of like, you know, incentivizing lieutenants, but only coming from lieutenants is something we had to change a little bit actually. But that's something that we'll look at again maybe in the next tier.
Yeah, and I mean, speaking of loot, it's one thing that we've kind of been looking at as community, the rare drops. Now, obviously, you're not going to give us the exact percentage, but is this something that, you know, with these rare drops, it is going to be a big event when one drops it? Are we looking at that sort of level? It's not something you're tuning the game around specifically, such as the bow from Raszageth.
Right. Yeah, I mean, like you said, I can't speak to the specific drop rate, although I imagine the community, you know, they're very smart and will very quickly kind of piece that together, I imagine, you know, kind of crowdsource the drop rate after a little bit. But you know, I will say it's not nearly like as low as like, you know, the 1% drop rate amounts, right? Like it will be different, but it should be something that you see multiple times within a raid tier, and you can get really excited when that thing comes out. I mean, you mentioned the bow on Raszageth, but you know, that's actually something that we've done in the past also. Like end bosses in particular, almost, well, especially in recent history, have had something that's a bit more rare and a bit more exciting. But it was never like clear that that was the case, right? You just kind of like learned over time, like, oh, this thing just doesn't drop as much. So we really wanted to increase the clarity there, right? We wanted to get, you know, the ability to say like, hey, this is a more rare thing, like in the dungeon journal. So with the ability to do that now, we thought, hey, this is a cool opportunity to not just do it on end bosses, but expand that throughout the whole raid. So we're experimenting a bit there with, you know, you'll see different items on different bosses are a bit more rare. Maybe they have some cool effect, or they're just higher item level. So there's a couple reasons for doing that, not the least of which is just like, you know, hey, when you've been farming the same boss for a couple weeks, it's really cool and exciting to get something a bit more rare that maybe you've been excited about for a little while, and it kind of keeps the value of those bosses even through farm weeks and stuff like that. So we're excited to see how it plays out. You know, we'd love to hear feedback on it. It's definitely an experiment, but given that we got the, you know, the tech essentially to more clearly communicate that, we were excited to experiment.
Awesome. Taking it in a little bit of a different direction. So untested bosses going live is pretty popular, I would say, at least from my perspective these days. Do you ever think we'll see a raid go live that's mostly or fully untested by the community?
Mostly or fully what? Sorry,
untested by the community, like no PTR.
Oh,
of
that's
the PTR?
interesting. You know, I will say it's possible. Like I never say never. But our priority, you know, will always be to create the best player experience possible, right? And you know, if we don't feel like we can do that, we won't release the raid fully blind. With that said, I think there is also more that we get out of raid testing than just, you know, encounter feedback. Like there's actually a lot of value that we get out of like class tuning, or you know, people can test out the set bonuses, and being able to test that in a raid environment is really valuable for tuning purposes as well. So we definitely think it would be awesome to, you know, have the opportunity for everyone to see a new season, you know, not just the raid also, but like, you know, maybe the new seasonal affix or something could be something that the community experiences together. We do think that would be pretty awesome. But ultimately, you know, our focus is on the player experience and making sure that that is as good as it could be. So, you know, as you've seen, we're still kind of testing the waters there and moving in that direction for sure. But you know, I think there's still a ways to go before we get to something like fully untested like that.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Would you say that you're still quite reliant then on the community testing that's being done on the like the PTR and whatnot versus like the internal kind of testing team? Like, how does the internal testing team go about it versus like the community testing? Like, what would you say the main differences are? Would you mainly say it's like on the tuning and like balancing and actually seeing like the players playing them, or what would you say the main differences are?
Right. I mean, like primarily on the PTR, like a thing that we really appreciate is when we get like less tuning, right? Like, because tuning is going to happen, right? Like we all know that's a thing that's going to happen. And if and if a boss is way too hard, trust me, we instantly know it's way too hard. Having, you know, 10,000 posts saying like, hey, this is too hard. Like, yep, we know. But something that we do find really valuable is that qualitative feedback of like, hey, this mechanic was just frustrating. Like it was just a pain in the butt, especially for, you know, this spec or this role or something like that. That is always really valuable. And having, you know, this massive pool of our, you know, awesome community testing that is invaluable to us. You know, our internal testing, our team does a really fantastic job finding all the bugs and giving us a lot of that qualitative feedback. But you know, the difference in the scale of those two groups is very different. Like the, you know, however many people are on the PTR versus our internal group, it's a very different scale. So certainly we'll often hear things that are very similar to what we've heard before when we go to the PTR.
Yeah.
But you know, especially like, you know, even most recently with the Thundering affix, right? Like that went through so many iterations just based on community feedback, which was really awesome.
Yeah, I mean, obviously the community feedback is always invaluable, and kind of sticking with the community feedback idea and the idea of testing. One thing that I think you can see sometimes during raid testing is obviously some bosses can end up being, or they can feel as though they are undertuned versus what we can do as players. Now, is that necessarily, is that the case? Is it a case of, okay, you know, you were unexpectedly doing more damage, so we're going to have to change the values of these bosses? Or is it more a case of sometimes you'll do that literally just to get information on abilities so that players can see certain abilities, how they deal with them, and then it enables you to tune it after the fact?
Yeah, so actually, I mean, we do intentionally kind of undertune the health on the PTR, right? Like seeing the same first 30 seconds of the boss like isn't terribly helpful. We want to see people get through a big chunk of the encounter. So yeah, we definitely do have different tuning targets, especially for some of those initial tests when we go to the PTR. With that said, especially with this round of, you know, PTR testing with Dragonflight, there were definitely some surprises there, right? Like like talents added a lot of power to the players, and you know, it's really hard to grasp, especially some of the interesting interactions that happen, right? Like, hey, when you take this talent and I take this one and that person takes this other one, there's some really fun synergy that happens there. And, you know, that definitely led to some pretty wild tuning out the gates on the PTR that, you know, we've definitely got a bit more of a handle on now. But yeah, that's definitely a thing that we very intentionally look at on the PTR.
Taking this back a little bit back to the race world first, what would be in your mind like the ideal length of a race world first? Like how would you describe like the difficulty curve in an ideal scenario?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm going to take a step back here. So something, especially with most recently that we were talking a lot about with Shadowlands and coming into Dragonflight, was making sure that the progression not only just is the duration, that we're wanting, which, if it makes it out of the first week, that's awesome. Like, I think if I had to throw an answer out there for something like that, like, hey, making it out of the first week, get some new gear, reprogress and kill it not too long after that first reset, or going into the middle of the next reset or something like that is probably where we look. It depends on the size of the raid, though. It depends on a lot of factors there, but something that we really have tried to focus a lot more on is not just that we're hitting difficulty targets, but also that the progression itself is really exciting, right? Like, we got a lot of feedback through Shadowlands that, yeah, like, this fight was really hard. Like, I hate to throw Stone Legion generals on the bus, but like, that fight was really hard, but it was hard in a way that felt frustrating, right? Like, the progression didn't feel good. And that's an area that we talk a lot about, especially when we're doing some of that early tuning, when we're looking at, maybe we're going to make some changes to a fight that people are actively working on. We always want to make sure that that progression feels really good, that, like, something that if you're, maybe consistently, we feel like the group might have mastered the first phase, but then they're only getting into the second phase like 50% of the time. We'll look at that and be like, well, why is that really inconsistent? Like, at this point, we know these groups are so freaking good. That should be 100% rep, right? Like, they should be able to get to phase 2 100% of the time. If they're not, there's probably some like really unfair wombo combo or bad timing, or like timing that's really inconsistent. So we spent a lot of time talking about that and making sure that the fights feel consistent and they feel really good to progress on. And not just like, oh, well, this is like, certainly, you can get wipe counts up really high by making things inconsistent, but I don't think anyone would enjoy that, right?
Yeah.
So that's definitely an area that we've talked a lot about for Dragonflight.
Yeah, that's great to hear. I mean, this many years designing bosses at this point, you guys must almost have the absolute perfect mix at your disposal. Is it going to be in this way? That's the question.
Yeah, it's really, kind of interesting. Like I was mentioning, some of the first changes that we'll go to make if we think we need to make a change to a boss is, before we even nerf things, we just say like, hey, is there like, something that we can change the timing of to make it more consistent, something that makes it less feel less random, so that this isn't something that they just have to hope it hits the right target, right, to be able to progress past this phase. So yeah, there's a lot of different elements to kind of tuning, mythic bosses, and that's certainly one of the ones that, especially early on, that's where we go to first before we say like, okay, well, do we actually just need to nerf this thing? As we try to make sure that the progression is consistent and fair.
No, that makes a lot of sense. That's for sure.
That's fair. I mean, you mentioned obviously the mix of boss fights. There's been so many over the years, and it's quite nice in Vault of Incarnates, from my point of view personally, that you've taken inspiration from the best boss you folks have ever done, which is Lei Shen. Throne of Thunder is the best raid ever. I will not be taking questions. Yeah, but you've obviously, I mean, it's fairly. It's easy to see that Kuro Grim Totem is slightly inspired by Lei Shen, and you could argue that Broodmother slightly inspired by Raszageth way back in Blackwing Lair. Is this something that you folks could potentially revisit now that there's been enough time? For example, bosses like Hansgar and Franzark and Thogar that you had, in obviously in Warlords of Draenor. Is that something we could see moving forward? Is kind of taking those mechanics that really stick out in players' minds and bringing them up to the more modern era potentially?
Yeah, I mean, like, ultimately, every raid tier we're trying to make the next Hans and Franz or the next Thogar, right? Like, we're always trying to make that thing that is the most memorable encounter. And often, yeah, we are inspired by these previous encounters and look to make, like you mentioned, you mentioned the one that was, very clearly inspired by Raszageth, right? Like, I think even in one of the first kickoff meetings, it was like, hey, what if we did Raszageth but 2022, right? Like, like, and how do we want to approach creating that? So definitely there's an element of like, what's old is new again, but then also, it just depends on who's working on it and what kind of geeks them out and what inspires them. But yeah, those are always fun to explore. And I think something that is in common with a lot of those bosses that you mentioned is when the environment is really heavily involved. I always personally am a huge fan of those. And I think Raszageth will not disappoint on that front. I'm sure you all have seen her room, even if you haven't had the opportunity to fight her yet. But her room is super epic. There's a bunch of different platforms, and we took we made very good use of that space. So yeah, I'm excited to see people get in there. And honestly, like I just like when people used to ask me what I did, like when I first started on the team, I would just say like I make dragons, right? Because like that was a thing, right? And it's so fun to be back in an expansion where like that's true. Like we get to make dragons. Like it's so just classic World of Warcraft that I'm just
100%.
so geeked out about that again.
Like actually on that note, I was going to ask, like, how close were you to actually putting maybe like Dragonflying in one of the boss encounters in the raid? Was that a consideration, or is that something that we can expect in the near future potentially?
Well, I mean, there is the like kind of like what do you call it, like the vehicle kind of flyover at the beginning of the raid, which is kind of neat. I think dragon flying in a raid encounter would be really challenging because like that puts you in combat, right? And like you can't mount while in combat, so we'd have to come up with some solutions there. But I do think like what we did in Noku Defensive was really cool, right? Like where you get to use the Dragonriding mount in that dungeon and kind of fly around the zone. I do think things in that vein are really awesome and would be really, really cool to explore something like that in a raid for sure, where you just kind of like have a big open space and get to fly around with your Dragonriding mount. Yeah, I mean, we love Dragonriding just as much as the community does. So anytime we have an opportunity to like use that somewhere, like we're all about it. So yeah, during an encounter, that would be rough just because combat restrictions, but in the space itself, I think that's totally an option.
I'm trying to remember the last time that there was like anything like that. I'm thinking about maybe like Ross or something back in Wrath of the Lich King or something.
Is it Malagos?
I think so, yeah. I'm
Well,
trying to remember. It's a long time ago, but yeah.
It's been a while. I mean, you speaking of sort of like obviously things that we can do and going back. You mentioned Raszageth Broodmother. There's obviously a crossover there. Just quickly, does that mean then that we should potentially be looking at mind control during the Broodmother fight? Very, very similar to obviously what we saw in Raszageth, because I know some of those mobs can be mind controlled. Is that something you deliberately allowed to kind of evoke that feeling of Raszageth once again?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, like, more than anything, we want the players to be able to use their buttons and feel really clever for it, right? Like, we, especially with the new talent system, right? Like there's so many cool options that are now available there. And I know the encounter team had a ton of fun just like kind of learning what all the talent trees looked like and learning about like, okay, well, with this stuff existing now, like what kind of cool new mechanics can we come in with? And yeah, mind control and creature and like getting a cool buff or something is always one of those fun ones. Or like, spell stealing a buff or something is definitely something that we're always looking for opportunities to allow players to kind of like feel like the hero. It's really funny often when people are like, oh, this is a thing that like they're totally going to fix. Like there's no way this is intentional. It's like, no, like we want you to be able to push your buttons, to use your buttons. We have many a debate / conversation about immunities in particular on this one as well, right? Like because immunities are so powerful, and it's so easy to as a developer to push the like I call it the like no fun allowed, just be like turn it off, like immunities don't work on this. But ultimately that's it's no fun allowed, right? Like we want to allow people to have fun with their buttons, and it's a challenge at times to like find a way to kind of redesign things so that stuff is all okay. And yeah, sometimes it ends up with you all or other really smart people doing things that were like, ooh, didn't see that one coming. But ultimately, right, like as an encounter designer, it's our job there to create interesting puzzles and then for the players to use the tools that they have to solve those puzzles. And sometimes it means that there's some surprises there.
Absolutely. Okay, so Shadowlands Season 4, do you think there'll be something like that in Dragonlance, Dragonflight at all?
So we thought it was actually like very successful. Like I think the community really enjoyed it. I would actually love to hear from you all. Like, would you all like to see a Season 4 again? Like, were there things about it that if we did do it again, you would want to see changed? I would love to hear from y'all.
I mean, for me, I think it was absolutely fantastic revisiting those raids and getting an idea of, we get to do these raids again, but there's a little added thing that we can do. To me, season 4 felt more like a celebration event than it was a here's something new for you, because obviously we're going through the old raids. It definitely feels like an opportunity for us to enjoy and have something quote unquote fresh to do as we lead into the next expansion. I think the only thing I would potentially change, and it's kind of something that has been brought up before in the past, the dinar system. Obviously, the dinar system and the ability to upgrade. I'd actually like to see that expand across the entirety of an expansion. Maybe not necessarily straight away, but say after 2 months or a month and a half or however long, then add the dinar system. So at least there is that bad luck protection. At least it kind of gives you an opportunity. Oh, hey, I'm bringing an alt through. I can get some different gear. So that would be my thing for season 4. But outside of that, I think it was a complete success. I absolutely love season 4.
Very cool. Awesome. Yeah, I mean, that was definitely an opportunity, like you said, to kind of celebrate, all the content that we had built, and find a way to kind of make it fresh again. And with the dinars, you know, one of the things we talked about is like, well, like I already earned a lot of this stuff. Like re-earning it isn't nearly as exciting, the second or third time, which is, that's another big reason why we really took a hard look at how we were handling our Mythic Plus pool, because it's like, how exciting is it to farm, my IQD for the third season in a row? Like, like can I get a different item to farm here? So we wanted to give you an ability to kind of earn one of those things more quickly. But yeah, item upgrades and that bad luck protection is definitely something that we've looked at and have expanded quite a bit, right? Like you saw with the Creation Catalyst and Shadowlands, and that came forward. And item upgrades are also something that we're continuously kind of evolving and looking at if there's other places where we would want to expand those types of systems into. So yeah, very cool to hear. And definitely, if that's something we do again, I'm sure, much like last time, that's something we'll engage the community on and ask what kind of changes they might want to see.
Yeah, sounds really good. For me, I guess the only important thing there is that it doesn't like replace like new content that might have come out in its place, if you know what I mean. Because new content for me, at least, is always the most exciting thing with World of Warcraft for sure. So that's obviously like an important balance to strike, I guess. But other than that, yeah, only positive things really. I have a couple of questions here from the raid team. One specifically on healer specific trinkets. Historically, been quite underwhelming compared to generalistic stat stick options. How would you try to approach making these trinkets more desirable? So that's specifically on like the healer specific trinkets. Any thoughts on that at all?
Yeah, healer trinkets are an interesting one, right? Because it's like, how often do you need just more throughput, right? Like throughput as a healer, like you usually, it's your resources that are limiting you more than anything. So we've definitely seen mixed results with like just creating big throughput healer trinkets. We're definitely trying something a bit different with healer trinkets in the vault. I'm sure that's probably why they were asking, because they're like, this is different. I think one of them is like a more of a modular, like, if you're low mana, it might grant some mana, otherwise it might deal some damage. That's another thing that we've noticed, is that often a lot of healers will want actually to get damage trinkets, because it's like, well, like I mentioned, you've got a lot of options for healing, and you've got a lot of options for healing throughput. You have fewer options for damage. So like, why not shore up some of your weaknesses with your trinket slot with damage there? So we're definitely trying some new stuff there, and experimenting with like what a healer may or may not find unique and interesting there. Something else to kind of add there is ultimately, like, we view trinkets as options, right? Like, I don't, just because you don't have a trinket equipped on every fight doesn't mean that we view that as a failure. Like, trinkets are kind of interesting in that regard, where like if there's a trinket that's really, really good for this one fight, but maybe not something that you would use in a lot of other cases, like that's totally cool. Like, we want you to feel like your kind of like box of trinkets are a bunch of different options that you can equip and use as you see fit. So just because there isn't, that one that you have on all the time doesn't necessarily mean that we think of that trinket as a failure in that regard. So that's definitely something that we're keeping an eye on with Vault, is how these new healer trinkets are received and used. But yeah, we've definitely seen in the past as well, like either damage trinkets or just like you know, we call them the stat stick trinkets, right? Like
Yep,
the ones
stat
that's like,
sticks,
here's a bunch of stats. Like this is what I use most of the time. Are really popular. So we're definitely experimenting there.
Yeah, and we're obviously coming up towards the end here, so I've got a couple of quick fire questions for you. Very, very simple. First things first, do we have any plans for allowing players to specify their mythic key level rather than having to keep upgrading it? Is it just, I want to go into this dungeon, I want it this level, let's go? Is there any plans for that at all?
Specify their key level. Not currently. You know, we did add the NPC to let you reroll keys recently, as well as more easily de-level them. But ultimately, like, we think the variety is really important for keystones.
Yeah, that's fair. Also, Evokers, big thing this expansion. Can we expect any special transmog sets for them? Because they are dragons, because we are dealing with dragons, is that something we could see?
That's a cool idea. I do think there's a Evoker only staff in the raid, right?
I believe so.
So that would
I
be
believe so.
something that's unique to them for sure. And then also, I mean, this isn't Evoker only, but I'm personally like super geeked out about the Raszageth kind of like Dragonriding skin. I imagine the first
Yeah.
time that thing drops, people will be they won't care at all about the you know, the eye level loot. They'll be like, I just want that thing.
It does look
so cool looking.
It does look very cool. And one final question. Speaking of Raszageth, kind of got to ask this. Any idea how much health we're dealing with on heroic?
A lot.
A lot.
More specifically, more than anyone else in the raid.
Okay, so we know it's going to be far and away above anybody else in the raid. There we go. Thank you so much for your time, Morgan. Greatly
Yep, thank you.
Thank you all. It was really great to chat.
Sco, and everybody else. Hopefully, we'll see you at BlizzCon next year.
That would be amazing if that was the case.
It would be fun to hang out in person. Yeah.
Is there a BlizzCon next year?
I have no idea.
The answer is yes.
The answer is yes. It has to be. That has to be. Well, there we go, folks. Thank you to Morgan Day. We'll see you folks shortly.